Welcome to my second presentation, which is part of a series that I'm presenting on South Africa and South African history. The series that I'm going to be doing today is on the Khoi and the Bantu history in South Africa. I hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, let's begin. The oldest evidence in the world documenting the emergence of humankind has been found in South Africa. Fossils of the earliest hominids date back at least 2.5 million years, and remains linked to modern Homo sapiens date back more than 50,000 years. Roughly 20,000 years ago, South Africa, still in the grip of the world's last ice age, was occupied by a people now known as the San. Remnants of San communities still survive as so-called Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert. The San, who developed their society over thousands of years in isolation, speak a language that includes unique click consonants. They are small-statured and have lighter skin pigmentation than the Bantu speakers, who later moved into southern Africa. The San obtained a livelihood from often difficult environments by gathering edible plants, berries, and shellfish, by hunting game, and by fishing. Gathering was primarily the task of women, who provided approximately 80% of the foodstuffs consumed by the hunter-gatherer communities. Men hunted, made tools and weapons from wood and stone, produced clothing from animal hides, and fashioned a remarkable array of musical instruments. San also created vast numbers of rock paintings, some of which I've included in this presentation. South Africa contains the bulk of the world's prehistoric art, which expresses an extraordinary aesthetic sensibility and documents San hunting techniques and religious beliefs. The rock paintings also demonstrate that considerable interaction took place among hunter-gatherer communities throughout southern Africa. You'll see that I've included some pictures of San rock art. Humanity's exodus from Africa. This is a very interesting thing that many people don't know, but humanity began its origins in Africa, and there was an exodus from Africa to other parts of the world. Let's look at that. You'll see I've included a link to some interesting articles on the topic. One of the biggest events in the history of our species is the exodus out of Africa some 65,000 years ago, the start of Homo sapiens' long march across the world. Now, a study of southern African genes shows that, unexpectedly, another migration took Western Eurasian DNA back to the very southern tip of the continent 3,000 years ago. According to conventional thinking, the Khoisan tribes of southern Africa have lived in near isolation from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. In fact, the studies show that some of their DNA matches most closely people from modern-day southern Europe, including Spain and Italy. Because Eurasian people also carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, the finding also shows for the first time that genetic material from our extinct cousin may be widespread in African populations. The Khoisan tribes of southern Africa are hunter-gatherers and pastoralists who speak unique click languages. Their extraordinarily diverse gene pool split from everyone else's before the African exodus. The Khoi engaged in extensive trade with other peoples in southern Africa. In exchange for their sheep and cattle, they acquired copper from the north and iron from Bantu-speaking Africans in the east, and fashioned these metals into tools, weapons, and ornaments. They also acquired dacha, or cannabis, from the coast of what is modern-day Mozambique, cultivated it themselves, and traded this for other goods. With sand, too, they bartered sheep and cattle products for game and hides. By 1600, most of the Khoi, numbering almost 50,000 people, lived along the southwest coast of the Cape. Most San, their numbers practically impossible to determine, lived in drier areas west of the 400mm rainfall line, including present Northern Cape Province, Botswana, Namibia, and southern Angola. These are very special isolated populations carrying what are probably the most ancient lineages in human populations today, says David Reed of Harvard University. For a lot of our genetic studies, we had treated them as groups that had split from all other present-day humans before they had split from each other. So he and his colleagues were not expecting to find signs of Western Eurasian genes in 32 individuals belonging to a variety of Khoisan tribes. I think we were shocked, says Reich. The unexpected snippets of DNA most resembled sequences from southern Europeans, including Sardinians, Italians, and people from the Basque region. Dating methods suggested they made their way into the Khoisan DNA somewhere around 900 and 1,800 years ago, well before known European contact with southern Africa. See the map on the next slide. The map on this slide shows the exodus into and out of Africa, which you should find very interesting. And his team found that the proportion of Eurasian DNA was highest in Khoi tribes, who have had up to 14% of Western Eurasian ancestry. What is more, when they looked at the East African tribes from which the Khoi descended, they found a much stronger proportion of Eurasian DNA, up to 50%. Just like the rest of the world, Africa had population movements too. There was simply no writing, no Romans or Greeks to document it. There's one more twist to the tale, however. In 2010, a research team, including Reich, published the first draft genome of a Neanderthal. Comparisons with living humans revealed traces of Neanderthal DNA in all humans, with one notable exception, sub-Saharan tribes like the Yoruba and the Khoisan. That made sense. After early humans migrated out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they bumped into Neanderthals somewhere in what is now the Middle East. Some got rather cozy with each other. As their descendants spread across the world to Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas, they spread bits of Neanderthal DNA along with their own genes. But because these descendants didn't move back to Africa until historical times, most of this continent remained a Neanderthal DNA-free zone. The arrival of the Bantu. Bantu-speaking Africans, whose descendants make up the overwhelming majority of the present-day inhabitants of South Africa, had moved south of the Limpopo River. Farmers who combined knowledge of cattle keeping and slash-and-burn cultivation with expertise in metalworking, the Bantu speakers came from West Central Africa, north of the Congo River, near present-day Cameroon. Historians and archaeologists now argue that this movement took place not in any single great migration, but rather in a slow southernward shift of people throughout sub-Saharan Africa that resulted from the gradual drying up of the Sahara, which began about 8,000 years ago. The southward movement involved not the conquering hordes previously imagined, but rather a moving frontier of farmers seeking new fields and pastures who interacted with pastoralists and hunter-gatherers, sometimes trading, sometimes incorporating people in client relationships, sometimes fighting for access to the same crucial resources. The farmers settled throughout southern Africa, east of the 400 mm rainfall line, and as far as the southwestern limits of cropping along the Great Khoi River. In one of the slides following a discussion on the Bantu in southern Africa and an area known as Kaffraria. In the early 16th century, explorer Leo Africanus described the Caffre as Negroes and one of 5 principal population groups in Africa. He identified their geographical heartland as being located in remote southern Africa, an area he described as Kaffraria. European cartographers in their 16th and 17th century versions of southern Africa maps likewise called the southern African region Kaffraria. In the late 16th century, Richard Hakluyt, an English writer, in his words describes Kafars and Khawas, translate to infidels and illiterates, not to be confused with slaves called Kafari, the Malagasy people called Kafres, and certain inhabitants of Ethiopia known as Kafars, as Bantu-speaking people of southern Africa in his work. Historically, past names of South Africa and records largely relied upon how European explorers to Africa referred to the indigenous people. In the 16th century, the whole coastal region was known in Portuguese cartography as Caffraria, and in French cartography as Costes da Cafres, which translate to the coast of Cafres of the South Limpopo River in 1688. Cafres, or Cafres, being a word derived from an Arabic word kafir, meaning non-believer, It was also known as the Bantu-speaking people's kingdom of Matupa at its peak. During the establishment and the time throughout the 18th century Cape Colony, South Africa was referred to as the country of the Hottentots and Kaffraria. Hottentot, by the way, is a deprecated reference to the Khoi people of the Western Cape, while Kaffraria stemmed from Kafir, which is now an offensive racial slur to South African Bantu language-speaking peoples. That, my apologies, is actually pronounced Kafir, but I don't like the term, and that's why I pronounced it the way I did. Other than Portuguese cartographers calling present-day South Africa's coast Kaffraria in the 16th century, another Kaffraria dub directly related to the present-day South African region covered the landscape as presented by Dutch cartographer William Blow's work, Theatrium Orbis Terrarum. The later derivative Kaffraria became a reference to only the present-day Eastern Cape. This slide shows you an old map by William Janszoon Blou, 1571 to 1638, and clearly shows Kaffraria and where it's located on the map, which I hope you find really interesting. When the early Portuguese settlers Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope in the late 15th century, a number of Khoi language speakers were found living there, and the indigenous population around the Cape primarily consisted of Khoisan groups. Following the establishment of the Dutch Cape Colony, European settlers began arriving in southern Africa in substantial numbers. Around the 1770s, trek boers from the Cape encountered more Bantu language speakers towards the Great Fish River, and frictions eventually arose between the two groups. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there were two major areas of frictional contact between the white colonialists and the Bantu language speakers in southern Africa. Firstly, as the Boers moved north inland from the Cape, they encountered Xhosa, Basotho, and Tswana peoples. Secondly, attempts at coastal settlement was made by the British in two regions, now known as the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. We move to the next slide. The Bantu-speaking farmers chose to minimize risks rather than to maximize production in their use of the environment. They kept large herds of cattle and invested these animals with great material and symbolic value, as they continue to do today. Cattle provided a means to acquire and display considerable wealth, and they were used for significant social and political transactions, such as bride wealth, commonly known as lobola, and tribute demands. Cattle were also valued for their milk and for their hides, but they were seldom killed for their meat except on ceremonial occasions. Hunting of game continued to provide a major source of protein, while additional supplies came from domesticated goats and sheep. Bantu speakers also cultivated a range of indigenous crops, including millet, sorghum, beans, and melons, along with other grains and vegetables. Those close to the sea collected shellfish and fished. By utilizing such a great range of food sources, the farmers spread their risks in a difficult ecological system constantly subject to drought, disease, and crop failure. Bantu culture and settlements in southern Africa. Tutswe in eastern Botswana consisted of a series of communities built on large flat-topped hills with fields cultivated below and cattle pastured locally. The residents smelted iron and engaged in extensive trade with people as far east as the Indian Ocean. Similar large communities emerged at least 1,000 years ago just south of the Limpopo River, where Bambandyalo and then Mapungubwe arose as significant early states, both situated at the intersection of the present-day borders of Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Cultivating extensive fields and holding large numbers of cattle, the residents of these states also produced finely worked gold and copper ornaments, hunted for ivory, and engaged in extensive long-distance trade. They were generally presided over by chiefs, who held considerable, although never total, power. Elders always had to be consulted about major decisions. Compared with the smaller-scale communities of San and Khoi, the Bantu-speaking societies were marked by greater degrees of stratification, of old over young, of men over women, of rich over poor, and of chiefs over commoners. The next slide gives you a photo of Mapungubwe and of a gold rhino that was found in this particular settlement. The people at Mapungubwe lived on top of this hill and used it as a fortification. So the hill is now in a national park called Mapungubwe National Park, which is in the Limpopo province in South Africa, which is located by the Khoi River. The national park borders Mapesu Private Game Reserve to the south, and it is on the border with Botswana and Zimbabwe and forms part of the Greater Mapungubwe Transfrontier Conservation Area. The whole national park was established in 1995 and covers an area of 28,000 hectares or 69,000 acres. The park protects the historical site of Mapungubwe Hill, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Mapungubwe, as well as the wildlife and riverine forests along the Limpopo River. The Mapungubwe Hill was the site of a community dating far back to the Iron Age. Evidence has also shown that it was a prosperous community, and as I mentioned, this was the site where they uncovered the golden rhino figurine, which is shown in my slide.